Welcome to Lecture 6, Terrorism in the Age of Decolonization. Terrorism picked up steam in the years just prior to and after World War I. World War I, 1914 to 1918, pitted the great colonizing powers of Europe against one another in a struggle for European and consequently global dominance. The great powers, including Great Britain, France, and Russia, ranged against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The U.S. entered the war in 1917 on the side of Great Britain and France, much to the chagrin, as we have seen, of the American left, particularly the anarchist movement, which viewed the U.S.'s entry into the war as a form of profiteering and blood money, because the United States had made millions of dollars selling weapons to both sides prior to their entry into the war. First, though, about colonialism. What is it? Beginning in the 17th century, the age of European colonization, or as some call it, the second wave of colonization, began in earnest. By 1900, Europeans controlled about 90% of the world's landmass. The main European colonial powers, Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and Great Britain, and eventually Belgium and Germany. But this map, I think, shows it best. Europeans controlled up to 90% of the world's landmass, with Russia, Great Britain, and France being the dominant colonial powers. Although Portugal had lost Brazil early in the 19th century, it still maintained colonies in Africa, in places like Mozambique and Angola, shown in green in the southern half of Africa. Tiny Belgium carved out its so-called Congo Free State, black in the map in South-Central Africa, and created one of the most oppressive, horrifically cruel colonial regimes in history, murdering millions of native Congolese in their quest for rubber and other precious raw materials. In the Pacific, the small Dutch Republic controlled the vast island chain of Indonesia, shown in orange, with its population many times the size of Holland. Germany would later join into the scramble for Africa, seizing control of a portion of West, South, and Eastern Africa, shown in gray on the map. Even the U.S. was in the great game of colonialism, seizing the Philippines from Spain's declining empire and briefly holding Cuba after the Spanish-American War. But the greatest imperial power of all was Great Britain, whose empire grew from about 9.5 million square miles in 1860 to 12.7 million square miles by 1909. On the eve of World War I, the British Empire embraced about 444 million people. The saying that the sun never set on the British Empire was literally true at the start of World War I, as you can see on the map. Colonial powers needed colonies as sources of raw materials, and they needed cheap workers and the potential of vast, untapped markets for manufactured goods produced in European factories. And to recap what I just said, by 1900, Britain was dominant in India, which was the centerpiece of its empire, and there was an obsessive British need for maintaining control of India, but also to control the approaches to India, which led Britain to try and create massive buffer zones around India, for example, controlling Iran by proxy, invading and taking Iraq from the Ottoman Empire, and also its invasion of Afghanistan. Africa was 90% under European control, with Britain controlling much of Central and South Africa and East Africa, but also including Egypt, while France controlled most of Northwest Africa. China was controlled by Western powers through treaties that created spheres of European influence, and Europeans controlled most of the world's surface. Ireland was part of the vast British Empire that stretched from China to Canada, and was one of the earliest and most heavily integrated sectors of the British Empire. Despite their long being part of the British Empire, Ireland maintained a distinctive Gaelic culture and language. Ireland was first conquered in the 12th century by Anglo-Normans from England. But by the 15th century, the Norman English elites had so thoroughly intermarried and become Gaelicized that the English King Henry VIII had to invade Ireland to re-establish the English presence. During this era, mainly in the early 17th century, during the reign of King James VI, the English also began plantations in Ireland, mainly by Scottish subjects. The plantations were large, planned farming communities resettled by Protestant Scots in the north of Ireland. That is, in what is now Ulster and other northern regions of Ireland, which were largely depopulated because of warfare and a lack of agricultural development. Many of the Protestant Scots who settled in Ulster would eventually emigrate to America, where they are known as Scotch-Irish. Senator John McCain, for example, and yours truly on my mother's side, are descendants of early Scotch-Irish immigration to America. However, many of these Protestants stayed, and in several northern counties of Ireland, as shown here on the map, they formed the majority of the population, while Catholics remain in a minority. In the South, Catholics are a clear majority. While it is beyond the scope of this lecture, this is part of the tension between the Protestant and Catholic communities in Ireland today, and why Ireland is divided politically. The Protestant North is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, while the South is an independent country, the Republic of Ireland. Leading up to World War I, Irish nationalist groups began to agitate for independence from Great Britain, with which Ireland had been united since 1801. Although the Irish had representatives in the British Parliament at Westminster, many Irish were never happy with their political dependence on the English. The so-called Anglo-Irish, mainly English or English and Irish mixed elites, controlled nearly all of the land. And you'll see an example of them in The Wind That Shakes the Barley, with the landowner who attempts to resist the efforts of the local Irish Republican Army cell. Great Britain viewed Ireland as a source of agricultural products, cheap labor, and capital investment from its moneyed landlord class. In 1840, famine struck Ireland because the British took nearly all grain produced on Irish farms to feed the cities of England. Irish peasants lived on potatoes. When blight struck the potato crop, more than 1 million Irish starved to death. This occurred as thousands of tons of Irish wheat and barley were being loaded onto ships sent across the Irish Sea to Great Britain. 1 million more Irish emigrated to America, the largest influx of immigrants of any nation. The famine caused such depopulation that Ireland has to this day never recovered its population it possessed in 1841. Many Irish Americans fought in the American Civil War, mostly on the Union side, as most Irish immigration was to the northern states where they worked in factories, although there were Confederate Union units of Irish volunteers, notably that from Charleston and also one from Louisiana. After the war, many of these Irish Americans turned their attention to Irish independence. Aided by relatives who remained on the island, and helped by the fact that the island was officially unified with England via the treaty establishing the Union of Ireland within the United Kingdom, Civil War veterans were able to travel freely to England. In 1867, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, an early nationalist group, staged a rebellion in an attempt to free the island from British rule. The so-called Fenian Uprising of 1867 was led by James Stephens, who was the head of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and he was backed by a group of loose associations in the United States, led by Bernard McNulty. American money and military expertise, based on knowledge acquired during the Civil War, was what the Irish were depending on to spearhead the revolt. In any event, the 1867 uprising was reactionary. It followed a failed Irish rebellion of 1848 and was in part a response by the British closing of nationalist newspapers in Ireland, as well as the suspension in 1866 of habeas corpus. In 1867, the Irish Rebellion is called the Fenian Uprising because the Gaelic term fianna was a term used for an ancient Irish male war band. The term Fenian is still widely applied in Ireland today. From 1866 to 71, about 1,000 Irish-American veterans of the American Civil War invaded Canada, which was still a part of the British Empire. They did so in order to pressure the British and bring attention to the cause of their fellow Irish who were colonized by the British. The United States disarmed the movement, but only after 5 raids were conducted, since the U.S. had obviously ambivalent views about the British Empire. Following the collapse of the 1867 Fenian Uprising, the Irish Republican Brotherhood launched a dynamite campaign aimed against the British. Again, Irish Americans who had served in the Civil War were in the forefront of this campaign, which lasted from 1881 to 1885. In 1881, the Irish Republican Brotherhood attempted 4 dynamite attacks in the mainland of England. The attacks were both pragmatic and symbolic. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, attacked London's Clerkenwell prison in December 1867, where a Fenian leader was being held in jail. This was a spectacular attack. The Irish Republican Brotherhood planted 548 pounds of gunpowder in the street that blew away a great part of the outer wall of the prison, but mostly ripped apart the neighboring street, where houses were badly damaged and 12 innocent people were killed, and more than 90 were maimed. As a result of the explosion, popular support within England, which had been running high for the Fenians, evaporated. Instead, the average English person now supported government repression of the Fenians and an end to the Irish question. As a result, the IRB ratcheted up its campaign with major attacks on the London Underground, an attempt to blow up London Bridge, and even a bomb planted at the foot of Nelson's Column. The campaign ended in 1885 when many of the IRB's members were either dead or imprisoned, and the nationalist movement went underground once more. World War I changed everything. Some Irish nationalists saw the war as an opportunity to free Ireland from the clutches of the British. And you'll see again more about the events surrounding World War I in The Wind That Shakes the Barley, namely the Easter Rising of 1916, when you'll see the characters discussing the seizure of the forecourts and the attack and the later Civil War seizure of the forecourts by the nationalists. The goal of the Irish nationalist movement was so-called Home Rule, which meant an Irish government would take over from the British. This, as the British knew, was de facto independence. While some within the British government favored some form of Irish Home Rule, in 1912 the British government formed the Ulster Volunteers, a Northern Irish Protestant paramilitary force loyal to Great Britain and intended to fight violently if necessary against Irish Home Rule. In response, in 1913, the IRB founded the Irish Volunteers, a paramilitary unit that would form the Revolutionary Vanguard. In 1914, with the outbreak of the war, many Irish were drafted into the British Army. Some 200,000 would serve in the British Army and Navy. In 1916, during Easter week, the IRB launched the so-called Easter Rising. Irish volunteers attacked the British in Dublin during Easter week and fought British forces for 6 bloody days. The British used machine guns and heavy artillery on the civilian population center of Dublin to overpower the Fenian rebels. Minor uprisings occurred simultaneously in the Irish countryside in places like Armagh and County Wexford. In the aftermath of the failed rebellion, more than 3,400 Irish men and women were arrested. Patrick Pearse and 15 other leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood were captured and executed. In the aftermath of World War I, the Irish broke into open revolt in 1918 under the leadership of those who favored an Irish Republic, Sinn Féin, or We Ourselves in Gaelic. The military wing of Sinn Féin, who was to fight a 3-year guerrilla war, is the original IRA, the Irish Republican Army. The IRA relied on veterans of World War I to staff its ranks and to provide military knowledge and leadership. The IRA had a developed intelligence network. One of its most famous leaders, Michael Collins, had a relative inside British intelligence in Ireland. The IRA worked as a guerrilla movement in the cities and countryside of Ireland, with acts of terrorism as a corollary, especially against policemen and guards of British assets, such as shipments of goods, money, and weapons. And all of this is really well illustrated again by the wind that shakes the barley. By 1918, Michael Collins, shown here at the bottom of the screen, was head of the IRB and the leader of the Irish Republican cause. By then, the IRA had worn out the war-weary and bankrupt British Empire, which sought a political solution. Eamon de Valera, then president of the Irish Assembly, sent Collins and other representatives to London to negotiate a treaty. The result was a divided Ireland. Collins defended his and his colleagues' actions in the face of widespread discontent. The Irish had hoped for complete independence and a united Ireland. Of course, what this means is that the island was partitioned, with the northern counties, Ulster that you saw illustrated a couple slides ago, belonging to the British Empire, and the southern counties, the Catholic counties, becoming part of the independent Irish Free State. Ulster was, and remains to this day, part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Michael Collins was bitterly disappointed by those who opposed the treaty, but the treaty signing caused a deep rift within the ranks of the nationalists, and soon pitted the Irish nationalists against one another. Collins had to make the difficult choice of defending the best deal he could get, which was a divided Ireland with a free Irish Free Republic in the south, from his rabid former brothers-in-arms of the Irish Republican Army, who rejected the treaty and demanded the fight to continue until Ireland was united once and for all under a free Irish government. The Irish Free State, as the South under Michael Collins was called, thus found itself fighting a bitter and bloody civil war, brother against brother, as you see depicted literally in the movie The Wind That Shakes the Barley, where Teddy embodies those pragmatists led by Michael Collins, who believed they truly got the best deal the British were ever going to give. The Irish Civil War, in which the IRA splintered, some members left to form the army and police force of the Irish Free State, while others remained opposed to the treaty and fought them. These were therefore factions called so-called pro-treaty forces and anti-treaty forces. The anti-treaty forces being elements mainly of the old Irish Republican Army. From the 28th of June, 1922 to the 24th of May, 1923, the Irish fought a civil war during which thousands died. Among them was Michael Collins, who was assassinated by the IRA men he'd once led. Collins today is viewed by many as a martyr for Irish unity and peace. The Irish were the first modern colonized country to break free from the colonial yoke. They did so by the use of violence and terrorism. Soon, the methods of the IRA would inspire nationalist movements from Spain to India. Their example was followed closely and most successfully in Vietnam, where nationalist guerrillas defeated first the French, and their communist successors followed suit against the United States from 1955 to 75. In Algeria, the National Liberation Front, the FLN, achieved independence for that country from France after a combined guerrilla war and terrorist campaign in 7 bloody years from 1954 to 62. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, suppressed bloodily by the British, in which more than 12,000 and up to 20,000 Mau Mau were killed, failed. But Cyprus, where the terrorist organization AOCA, led by George Grievous, terrorized the British colonial power from 1955 to 60, was a rousing success. The wars against colonization had begun.